So my understanding, and George and Roger, correct me if I'm wrong. So you're going to be talking about the work that you've been doing together on behavior change to impact, what people can do to mitigate climate change. And that is ultimately intended to become a deep dialogue, I think. That's been my sort of understanding of where you're going with this. So,
yeah.
Okay. And that ultimately, I have been in my own mind thinking that'll be sometime this fall. So,
yeah, I think that's, you'll see today that this is still a work in progress.
Okay.
I said, maybe with George can add to this, but I just give you a brief introduction that for the last few months, George and I have been meeting, started out mostly with George is doing this extraordinary deep dive and look into all kinds of things related to behavior change, and even looking at big picture of how we got into this mess on some level in some very creative ways. And he's going to be bringing to the table a lot of stuff that he's discovered that I think is of great interest and very specific around climate change behaviors per se. It kind of emerged that my greatest contribution might be going back to my career in medicine and looking at health behavior change models, because behavior change, well, in psychology, but also in medicine, drawing on psychology is a huge enterprise, because everybody wants to figure out how to change health-related behaviors on multiple levels. So NIH and everybody has been pouring money for decades and decades into these things, and people have produced dozens of models and approaches, and it goes on and on. So I got into exploring that. And I think from my perspective, this is not your typical presentation where we identify a topic on which we're looking for the scientific consensus and get focused, and we're presenting the evidence to everybody, and here's what's going on, and it's a very big, complicated area that kind of merges into lots of other big concepts. So I think I'm hoping you'll find this really interesting, but we're hoping that you'll help us kind of understand we need to integrate this, all the stuff that we found, and get focused in a way that might be accessible to the average person. And I think George and I have talked about, maybe this would start off with a deep dialogue, but then, some of this gets pretty much into the weeds of stuff, and it might go into what we call an expert series, where people who really want to get down into the essence of this might be engaged. So George, I don't know, how accurate was that?
I think it was a great kickoff, Roger. So maybe we'll like Roger said, there's definitely a work in progress. And one thing that we've both learned in diving into this is that everybody will have kind of coming at things from a little bit different angle. And so one of the challenges is, especially in the initial presentation, if it's a deep dialogue or something like that, is at what level do we present, and how deep do we go? If we want to leave it as just a single deep dialogue, then it'll be more, we might pick certain categories and really focus to give examples. Alternatively, if we're thinking, and this is up to you guys giving us feedback, if we do think there's a possibility for pushing into either a couple of deep dialogues or going into an expert series, that may change the dynamic on the first presentation. But I think the thing to do is to initially kind of throw everything at the wall, see what sticks, see what people really want to be interested in. And now that we're interacting with a couple of trained psychologists, we may alter some of our stuff. The other thing that I'll point out, and both Roger and Ernie have heard me talk about this a little bit in the past 5 days, and I think it's a great way to kind of start in on this. The past 5 days, I realized something a little more about myself with everything that's happened. And in talking with my wife about what's happened over the past 5 days and how that impacts what we're doing and how we're doing it, I felt really pretty depressed. And so I'm going to challenge Roger, since as a physician, he probably had to think about how do you avoid physician burnout, and is there a correlation with us, and how do you make sure you can keep moving ahead? So that's kind of in the back of your mind while we're discussing all this stuff. And I guess the thing that I could do initially is I can share the screen, and we can just kind of bounce through what we've got. And then at the end, get the feedback from folks, tell us you're going in the right direction. Maybe you should add this. Here's some ideas. Would that work for everybody? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can share. Yeah, okay. So this is based on what Roger and I had talked about over the past month or two. And yesterday we kind of came to what we think is a reasonable framework. And it may be part one, part two. Part one being deep dialogue, part two might be something more. But really, we only have kind of part one sussed out much. But the way we're thinking about it is posing the question is, why is behavior change hard for climate action? And so I've got a couple of concepts that we could go over, but basically it's not like other energy transitions. So if you compare it to like when muscle and wind was most of the energy, 200 years ago, and there was a transition to fossil fuel, that transition actually has a lot of different parameters about how it was accepted and taken up and society responded. The second thing that I found in looking at this is that the climate change problem is what people have actually scientifically called the wicked problem, which means it has all kinds of ramifications. If you try to fix one part, you break another part. It's so huge. There's no end. There's no beginning. It has lots of parameters, but it's a nice way to kind of separate it and give people a sense of it's really immense and huge. And then the question becomes, wicked problem, how do you break those pieces down? Can you solve parts? And how do you get other people involved? The third piece that I was interested in is, because it's a wicked problem, because it's this giant thing, what does human psychology say about that? And how does human psychology deal with it? And so I can go into some of the parameters and ideas there that suggest it's very difficult for humans to tackle something that's so big and amorphous and in the future. And then Roger has been looking at a lot of the approaches and models that are used in healthcare and things like that. And we're kind of looking at can we apply those things? And if so, what do we get out of that? What sort of intuitions and changes to behavior can we drive and can we do in ourselves? The part two piece goes kind of the next step, which is more interactive. It may be people actually doing some introspection, thinking about why am I not doing this change, or what are the barriers to it? It comes out of what we'll talk about in the first part. And maybe we can actually get results from a group and from groups to help put together something that says, okay, here's a reasonable set of approaches to take. So that's kind of the 100,000 foot view. any thoughts kind of immediately on that?
Just want to hear more detail.
Okay. Roger, you have anything to throw on?
So this could be a time when, if you want to just stop your share, I'll just bring up the first slide or two that kind of grounds us a little bit more in terms of what we're talking about. And then I'll turn it back to you, George, in terms of your piece on psychology. I just have to find my...
Peter Gunnarsson explains to us exactly how. The company he works for developed the process.
What's that? Sometimes I hit YouTube when I'm going through here, so God only knows what I have. Okay, I found what I'm looking for here, so I think I can pull this up and show you.
We just lost our new person.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, that's too bad. Well, hopefully she'll be back. Okay, so should be coming up on your screen momentarily, and yeah. So just to be a little bit more specific about what we mean by behavior and why it's important, folks have seen this before, and I think in a variety of contexts and a number of deep dialogues. So my intention wouldn't be to go into this in great depth, but it just documents the amount of carbon emissions that are related to the kinds of decisions and activities that we deal with in our daily lives: eating, living, moving, buying, and having fun. That's all there is to life, I guess. And so you can see that there's about 9.7 tons of CO2e per capita per year generated through all those processes in Canada. And then it gets substantially less here in, no, that's the average. I'm sorry, it's 14 in Canada, 8 in Japan, down to 4 in Turkey. Then you go down to Indonesia, we have 2.2. And this little hatched bar here, this tells us where we need to be by 2050 in order to accomplish our net zero goals. So you can perhaps see that we have a long way to go, a lot of decisions to make, a lot of behaviors to change. And these are the behaviors that we have kind of decided to be looking at. And I grouped them into just as a start, as we think about potential barriers to making things happen. Some of these decisions fall into one category or another. Some primarily are driven by how much money is it going to cost me. So that would be your housing retrofit and buying your EV. Some of these things, in my mind, have to do, a main barrier is foregoing pleasure, reducing air travel, getting to see family, going to Europe, reducing meat and dairy. We enjoy our meat, we enjoy our dairy. That's going to have to give up those pleasures, we think, and consuming fewer goods. Buying things, a lot of buying that we do is to make us feel better, to look better. We buy clothing to look better. So those are the foregoing pleasure behaviors. And then a lot of things we're doing really have to do with investing time and doing things that are perhaps logistically inconvenient. And they're kind of interrelated phenomena. And those are a lot of the other ones. Using public transit instead of driving, cutting down driving. Basic composting and recycling takes a little bit of time, a little bit of organization. Trying to avoid single-use plastic. That might take a little bit more work, actually, given how much of it's out there. Avoiding fossil fuel investments. George's been involved in a group of people trying to get their money out of Bank of America and various other things. And he invited me to go join him, and I said, time and convenience. It's like, oh, this is going to be what a pain. It's going to take me forever to do this. I'm not sure I can get on board. And then we even threw into here increasing our political action on an individual level. Can we even extend it to that? We thought about those things. So that is, I think that's all I'm going to say here. Yeah. And then I'm going to turn it back to George. So and if folks have comments, we're just trying to ground this in some specifics to kind of get things going.
That's interesting that you have it in those sort of three main categories. Is that something that you came up with, Roger and George, or is that just okay?
We collectively invented that.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I said, a lot of what we're going to present today is kind of the product of two brains interacting, and not so much necessarily bringing other. We bring a lot of other ideas to the table, but we mess with them. Let's put it that way. And it's a little unclear who's going to take credit for what. It's not a simple focus thing. Anyway, George.
All right, I go back and I'll share the next piece. Obviously, when we put this together, we'll try to do it a little smoother, and we'll get rid of the rough edges. But anyway, so another area that impacts the behavior of somebody are a lot of psychological issues, and this is where Amy and Barbara and folks can really probably say that's good, that's not good, and we'd love that sort of feedback. But when you think about these extremely hard problems, and actually let me just to give you a sense of the sort of problem we're looking at. The wicked problem, like I mentioned, is it is multifaceted. You can't characterize it. The logic's not obvious. You fix one aspect, another goes out of whack. And one of the things that's really clear is, depending upon who's looking at it and what angle you're looking at things, it can be an economic problem, it can be a land use problem, ideological problem, governance, etc. And the thing that we've learned the last 5 days is you can have everything kind of set up, maybe it's going in the right way, and then something comes in and blows it out of the water. So not to dwell on that. But the other part, to kind of let people do some introspecting and thinking about when they're talking with people about climate change, things to be aware of, all the biases that everybody brings to the table. And it's things like optimism bias, which you tend to think it's going to be okay. Cognitive bias, where if you don't really understand it, it's not going to be true. Hyperbolic discounting is actually really important on this, which is the situation where if something is immediate, it's very important. By about, if it's 5 or 10 years out, it's much less important. You don't worry about it. Beyond 15 or 20 years, it's not a problem. And so that's one of the challenges of convincing people that they need to change behavior for climate change, is the immediacy of the problem. Focus, that also is an issue. And one of the interesting things I've run across is the concept that there are two brains inside your head, the emotional versus the rational. And the emotional brain is the one that actually drives an awful lot of behavior. It helps memory as well. And unless you take, so we can look at graphs, we can look at charts, we can hear numbers and all that kind of stuff, and we can understand them. But the thing that's really going to make us change our attitude and our behavior is whether we can get to that emotional piece, emotional brain. And one of the things that drives that are good stories. And the people that have the good stories right now are the deniers. It's hard to find a lot of good stories about climate change going ahead. And so that's something that if people start to think about this, maybe there are ways we can present climate change in a somewhat optimistic view, and that would help convince people they need to think more about what they're doing. And of course, all of the societal confounding, the government, the social amplification, especially with social media tends to amplify fear as opposed to, hope. And one thing that's interesting is this idea of pluralistic ignorance, which we all underestimate how much Americans value, are concerned about climate change. And so what that does, since we underestimate it, then the social media popular press tends to state that it's less popular, which is this circular event loop that tends to push things down, moves them out of, legislators don't worry about them as much. People, don't worry about them and changing their behaviors. So anyway, all of this kind of leads up to, and I don't know if, Roger, do you want to jump back in at this point, or do you want me to go through this little piece first?
No, I think you should go through this this piece. Yeah.
Okay. So after all that, stuffing people's heads full of, why it's hard and why we understand it and we feel it's hard, we want to try and start to come up with a little bit of a framework or ideas around what can you do. And so there's one aspect which Roger will talk about, which is taking maybe a couple of specific actions and getting people to get involved. And I'll stick with the, excuse me. I'll stick with kind of the 30,000 foot piece. So looking at things like moral imperatives, which really says you don't want to blame people for it, because that creates resentment, and then that is kind of it'll cause a backlash. But you also want to have a certain amount of moral license to say, I understand there's all this anxiety, but what we need to be is creative, innovative, strategic. But you also have to remember that you're making an informed choice. And one of the things that I've been seeing very recently is kind of a shift that is the big motivator, and this feeds back into the emotional brain piece, is that we want to protect the things that we love. And so if we can really frame the narrative in more of a sense of what the future needs to be, that may actually be a way to go. And we can talk about, at the social level, what needs to be done and how you do things to help people understand the problem and then work down their process of behavior change, which I'll throw it back to Roger, who has the models for what that should probably look like.
Barbara, you got your hand?
Yeah, very quick question. Two questions. One, are you going to send your screenshots around to us? It would help at the end.
We can, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and the other thing is, I just want to know where this question in my mind fits in your beautiful sets of ideas. I've been noticing that oh dear, just a minute. I will quickly, I'll just say it, and then I have to go take an important call. But I've been noticing that the words oil and the whole system of oil and its influence is never mentioned in public television. And it's like looking at the tidal wave that's behind the people and the force it represents. Now, I'm sorry about that. If you could just keep that in the back of your mind, tell me where it fits. Thank you very much. I've got to go. It's an emergency call. Bye-bye.
I mean, I can actually jump on that a little bit.
Oh, okay.
And so let's see, where was it? Yeah, basically, it fits into what the government and the media is doing, and it's been described as the trough of ignoring. And starting about 2009 to about 2012, and then 2016 onward, the media didn't address these questions. You know, in the 2012 debates, climate change was actually never brought up, even though it was a very important topic. And so both government and media decided that they weren't going to address it. And I think that's probably what Barbara is talking about, is why aren't we focusing and pointing our fingers directly at oil companies? I don't know. It's a great question. I think it's something that everybody can help us address.
Ready?
Yeah, so I thought this was really interesting, and it certainly does come at it in many different ways. And it seems to me that there is something else which is behind at least much of the psychological section, I think that George talked about. I think he mentioned to you all a while back that there's a book called Minding the Climate: How Neuroscience Can Help Solve Our Environmental Crisis. And it was written by a woman who's a pediatric neurosurgeon, if you can imagine being that, at Harvard. And so she wrote the book, and she talks a lot about the reward system, the basic reward avoidance system, which, you know, is present in every organism and in us in many big and complicated ways, many of which are reflected in the topics that Roger and George brought up. So you all had mentioned the possibility of an expert series or an expert presentation, and I am thinking that it wouldn't hurt if we could get her to come and talk to us, to have an expert piece like this, which is, it's really fundamental and in the weeds. No way, two ways about it. You're welcome to read the whole book, which I did in a class at Harvard Institute. But, you know, maybe if we could get her to talk focused on the kinds of things that we are trying to accomplish, maybe it would be useful. But I think in any event, somewhere in there ought to be something about, you know, this fundamental reward avoidance system that we are all.
Betty, can you define reward avoidance?
Okay. So, you know, if you have an amoeba and it encounters something that it doesn't like, it will retreat from it. And if it finds food or something which for other reasons it finds a good thing, something that promotes its existence, it helps it to live, then it will go towards it. It will, you know, embrace it one way or another. That's a really simple example, but, you know, we are driven by what we find to be a reward. And among rewards, you might consider things like our own health, our families, love for others. These are all sort of things that you all had listed, but they're part of the reward system that it operates in our brains and is, you know, I'm looking for the right word. It's been part of our evolution forever, and every other living organism too, for that matter. But, you know, it's a helpful frame for being able to assess. I mean, if it's something that is helping us live, that we like, that's part of the reward system, and we will embrace it. And if it's something that we don't like, you know, then we will avoid it. And it operates on a really fundamental level. Am I making myself clear?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. Yeah.
Can I just add something to that, Betty? You're absolutely right, but I think Roger mentioned this in passing. The issue here is one of what's often called delayed gratification. So the emotional brain tends to seek rewards that are immediate.
Yep.
But the rational brain can calculate rewards that may be delayed. So, smoking is pleasurable, so you do it, but in the long term, you're going to screw yourself. So a lot of the pleasures, like the eating and the thing that Roger showed on that graph for Canada, to reduce that, you have to basically look at the future. And that is a very fundamental cognitive challenge
Yeah,
that we
it
have
is.
as humans.
It's what we can perceive or not perceive. I mean, one of the things she mentioned in the book as being a real challenge to think about environmental issues or to think about CO2 is that we can't see it. It is not something that's visible to it. We perceive it through our cognitive brain, not our emotional brain. And it makes it way harder, as you say. The emotional brain kicks in automatically. The cognitive one doesn't come first. It comes later, and it doesn't always come. It's a choice that has to be made to use this energy burning, difficult, second level kind of brain work. I mean, when they have, I don't know if you read Thinking Fast and Slow, but it talks about that too.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that in terms of our learning underlying what George and Roger are talking about doing, which is, way more practical, I think it would be helpful for us to understand this at that very, very, very fundamental level. And that would be an expert series. And what you all have been saying, it seems to me, are manifestations of this in the real world. So yeah, we're talking different levels, but I think it isn't a bad idea to think about it, this unifying thing. So yeah, there you are.
Yeah. Thank you, Betty. Rashid, do you have?
Yeah, I wanted to make another different point, which is to George and Roger. The one thing that I don't see kind of coming up here is sort of the idea of justice, which can be a great motivator for people. And I think the idea of justice is sort of intimately linked with the idea of responsibility. And you do mention responsibility, but I think it could be kind of unspooled a little bit more as to what responsibility, whose responsibility, and responsibility so what, etc. And in a way, beyond personal responsibility that may be underlying the message of that graph that Roger showed, to some degree, personal responsibility. There is the other part of the responsibility is what Barbara was saying, which is a financial system, if you will, that rewards certain behaviors. Like the oil companies keep digging for more oil and selling it because of the financial rewards that they get from that. And there is a whole sort of a system behind that. So it gets into this wicked problem, and it's sort of, as you put it quite wisely, and some of the other manifestations of that are a little bit maybe beyond the psychology, but related more to the way a system of, government or society are organized.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
Unmute.
yeah.
This discussion makes me think of a hierarchy of changes. One is incremental change, and most people make incremental changes and have to be motivated to do that. And that may mean that phony meat is cheaper than hamburger, therefore they might buy phony meat instead of buying beef. And that will be an incremental change that they'll have to overcome. That's not a great example, but it's one example. However, other changes are so potentially monumental, like developing fusion energy, that it takes a lot of money, and then there are a lot of stakeholders involved in either supporting or opposing that. The rewards are financial in large companies. But people who would otherwise have to move incrementally will be impacted by that tremendously without having to do a thing. In other words, their electricity will come from fusion energy. So that's a totally different behavior model than motivating me to stop eating meat or not go on a trip to see my kids in England. And so there are different levels, different hierarchies involved. Moving from off of natural gas and stopping it leaking has big stakeholders behind it. It's like the utilities, but there's also a movement of individual actions that are polled. Polls say everyone wants to get off of natural gas. People don't like natural gas in their stoves, and they want to do that, except the forces against them are so big that only a large number of individual actions taking political action will go ahead and change that system. And that's sort of what's happening now, I think, in Massachusetts on the natural gas issues. But it's taken a long time to do that. But that's organizing. That's organizing a political force, which is different than convincing me to eat artificial meat as opposed to real hamburger, which is a totally different set of motivating factors. And I keep thinking back to the Japanese model of a guy named Soji Shiba, who was a recognized guru in total quality management that I happened to know and play golf with when he was here. And he kept saying, you have to be driven by the noble goal. People do get attracted by a noble goal, and how you define that in different circumstances is hard to do. His area was quality management, and driving CEOs to develop quality management systems. But I love the idea of the noble goal that someone referred to earlier. I think it was George. Or it's not moral. It's just a noble goal could be as little as getting a piece of legislation passed because it's going to change things legislatively and as a project, and so you have a noble goal of having that follow because you think the result is good.
Amy, you're on mute.
So I have two questions. One is sort of in response to what Ed was just saying. I had the impression that you're focused more on personal behavior, personal motivation, rather than, and maybe that would lead to familial or community behavior change rather than, institutional or political. So I'm just kind of wondering, oops, can you hear me? Everyone looks
we
frozen.
can hear you, but you're frozen, but we can hear you.
Oh dear.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Did I freeze? Everybody else is frozen. So were you able to hear what I said?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
So
So that one question was the scope, sort of where are you drawing the boundaries around psychology and behavior change? And the other question is, I wrote it down and left it in the other room. Oh yeah, just sort of what because you presented lots of interesting information and it's very complex. Just what your goals are for presenting this, sort of that would help me think about different ways of organizing it or what to present. Are you hoping people will become more aware of what affects their behavior and their choices and be motivated to change? Are you wanting to learn more from people in the audience so that we can be part of sort of a communal figuring out how to do things better? What are your goals? And you don't have to answer it right now. That's just sort of what my thinking is for how to organize all the information you have.
Yeah, that might help you going forward. I mean, I think there, as George said, sort of the part two piece might be what you said, getting people to reflect and also helping us to learn, sort of digging a little bit deeper into what's moving you, what are your barriers, what gets you going. We might have an exercise around that, applying a few concepts, and then we would learn from that in terms of, oh, this concept works, nobody brings this up, or there's a whole new thing coming here. That would be kind of the part two piece. The part one piece, I mean, I see as where you'll see it's going is the notion of how do we develop interventions that are effective in accomplishing the behavior change that we want to accomplish? What are the tools that we have available? Is there any theory that can help us be more effective when we say, okay, we have $1 million to do a campaign to get people off of meat. How are we going to spend that? Who do we focus on? How do we reach them? What do we say? All of the above. Is there, is any of this theory going to be helpful in that? And George, you might want to embellish that.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think actually some of this, some of the thoughts might be answered by the next part, which do you want to jump into a little bit of the actual theories that are involved in getting people,
sure.
Kind of this linear approach to getting people to change. So,
I did just to quickly respond to Ed. I think the place where I'm going to go kind of assumes that people exist currently in an environment that we hope, politically, we hope will change over time to make the environment a lot easier to encourage these behaviors or insist that they happen by developing punishments if they do. There are a whole variety of things in the environment that you're talking about, Ed, that can make these things happen, move them forward or not. But we're talking about, okay, given the environment we're in now, and we need to be checking on that next year and the year after, it's going to change. But given that environment, given that individuals do have to make some decisions in that environment around particular things that we're talking about, are there some things we can do in that context even before we make the dramatic changes and we figure out a way to get off the gas system and all that? So that I think that's kind of where we're at. But let me go ahead and share a screen. I think it will become a little clearer as we get into this. If did I lose my slides here? Apparently,
you're finding those, Ed. I just wanted to respond with one of the things that I've used, at least on the historical basis of how things are changing, is the punctuated equilibrium model, which came from biology, but it actually goes through the same sort of thing, that you're in an equilibrium state for a long time, and then you get some event, it's technological or motivational or something, that allows you to completely switch to a new state, which is, I think it might not be the same, but it's similar to this. You need a lot of energy to break out of basically an equilibrium environment. So
that's something you left out of your presentation that maybe needs to get brought back in on some level at some point put that to respond to Ed's question up front, potentially to locate where we're starting from and where we're going, to also to respond to Amy's question. Maybe that belongs as part of our introduction so people have a better sense. So my part is going to focus on health behavior models, and this is going to be just a brief introduction to where do they come from. As I was saying, for decades, people who do research in the healthcare field have been concerned about folks who smoke, folks who use too much alcohol, folks who don't exercise enough, folks who have a diet that's not appropriate, folks who have a hard time managing their diabetes and are not following directions. So changing the behavior of patients has been a focus and continues to be a focus. And in the work that I did, it was about how do we get more women to get mammograms, to understand what they're about, what the benefits are, what the risks are, but also then how to make it easy and make it second nature. How do we work with women around that, with what messages to move them in that direction? So this has been going on for a long time, and a lot of models have been developed, some theories to help a researcher develop an intervention that might be more or less effective. where do the data come to build these models? Well, some of it comes from interviewing patients and asking them like, well, what floats your boat? What would make you change? And then kind of throwing that into the model, or surveying patients to get that. Looking at psychology, some of the basic concepts of psychology, just how the mind works. So that might be thrown in there as a concept. There's not a lot of evidence that supports these models. The way people want to gather evidence on models is you take a model, you develop an intervention. If the intervention is effective, that model then becomes something that people may respect more and feel like it works. So the evidence is that you use the model, you do something with it, the intervention accomplishes the objective, then the model becomes more desirable. And that's how the evidence evolves supporting these models. And there are lots of different types of models. There's a really big picture models, which we'll show you. There's a long list of models focused on a few concepts, so we're not going to go through many of those. There's an integrated model that I came across, which I didn't even know about a year ago, that I find draws elements on from most of these models. And I think that's where we can learn the most, by looking at something that's been put together. And George and I talk about then taking some of his concepts and trying to incorporate it in this more integrated model to see if we can come up with something that's more specific for climate change. And then lastly, I've also become more interested in just what's kind of a very simple model. People don't even talk about as a model, is barriers and facilitators. If we sort of see that's the basis of our theory: identify barriers, identify facilitators, amplify facilitators, remove barriers. That's how we change behavior. That's a simple approach we'll get into a little bit. So I'm not gonna, this is I was just going to show a long list and say, here are some of the names and models that we're not going to be talking about. But you can see that there are many, many of these. And I'm going to give you just one example right now, so you get a sense of what a model is. And this is one that I've worked with quite a bit, and actually has been kind of integrated into this integrated model as a very important part. Makes a lot of intuitive sense. It has been used in a lot of studies. I think people feel like has been somewhat successful in helping them focus on a particular audience. So what this says is that for every behavior, there are these 5 stages. People begin in pre-contemplation, where they don't actually really know anything about the problem, or why they should change. Is there any benefit to change? They're really kind of clueless about what's going on. And you can see here, what the idea here is you develop strategies or interventions that are related to a specific stage. So here, obviously, education becomes the issue. People have to be aware of what's going on. And realize that, well, there could be some benefit. So now they can at least contemplate the possibility that maybe this could help me. So but they're in the thinking about stage. And they're wondering, could I take a step on this? What are the problems? There are a lot of barriers I have. I'm not sure I could get past that. You're hoping that in that process, you'll develop motivation by working with them around their concerns and working with them around their barriers and misconceptions. So an intervention here to move people to preparation would be different from one that is focused primarily on education. And then once people have enough motivation that they say, okay, I think I'm going to try this, then you got to make sure that they're equipped, that they feel like they can do it. They have the skills, the physical ability, the materials are available. It's not going to cost too much. And they have now they have the motivation, and you put that together with the capacity to actually accomplish it. And that's when you get to action. So this might involve, if you're trying to get people off of meat, you get directions to Whole Foods. It's like, okay, you need to know how to get to Whole Foods, or you're not going to be able to find tofu anywhere else, or another store where there might be tofu. So something basic like that. So then they're in the action phase. They've gone to Whole Foods. They've purchased some fake meat. They've come home. They started eating it. It's become a relatively regular thing. So then you want those folks, you want to make sure they keep doing that. So then there's a reinforcement piece that goes along with that. And that might be some new recipes, there's a new tofu product at Whole Foods that you really have to try. It's really going to make you happy. And then finally, you get into a maintenance phase. You hope people don't slip back and relapse. So you have to kind of continue to support people in the effort. We remind them it's really important, and it's going to be good going forward. So the concept is different interventions for different stages, and that becomes pretty central throughout all of this. And yeah, so this is just kind of a summary of what I said. I'm not sure I would do it this way, but I was giving an example based on the meat stuff, which I kind of went through. So some folks have tried to put together all of this information into one big model. What you can see, they've taken the stages or trans-theoretical model down here. They have awareness at the beginning. They throw preparation and contemplation into the same place where you're building motivation. And then we have the action part. They actually throw some planning into here. It's a little mixed up, but that's how essentially those stages through not knowing, knowing something, not being motivated, getting motivated, planning and acting, and then you're there, the behavior is accomplished. Now, and you can see the little things that are involved at each stage. We've talked a little bit about those, but they have identified some key elements of attitude, social support, something called self-efficacy, which really means a belief, I think I can do this. It's as simple as that. It's like, okay, I think I have the capacity. I feel like it's possible. And then they have to have a very distinct intention. That's the highest level of motivation that they get. So these are the factors that play into building motivation and things you can work with. And these are the action planning things, like we talked about, the very concrete barriers. You might be, you don't have a car to get to Whole Foods, so you got a problem. That's a barrier. But then surrounding all of this are many, many other factors that can have an impact on every stage. So that's why they're in a big box of their own. And so information makes a difference all along the way. And these can be personal factors. That's what is your knowledge of something, messages, but messages are important in terms of how they're constructed and what they say, but it also is important what channel they come through. Is it social media? Is it friends and family? Is it the owner of the grocery store? Or through the grocery store. Then you have the source factors. How credible is the person? Somebody you really believe, you really trust or not. So all of that information factor can play a role all along the way here in different forms and fashion, and you need to be thinking about that. And then you have these preceding factors. And to Ed's point, one of the environmental factors is an environmental factor, for example, would be, stores don't see tofu as profitable. so they're not stocking it at all. And we need to protest. We have to go down to probably not to Whole Foods, but we have to go down to Stop and Shop and have a big protest and make sure they start stocking tofu, because the environment is discouraging people or making it very difficult for them to change their behavior. And then you have personal behavioral factors, which could just be habits. I'm just not used to doing this. I have a hard time learning how to cook. It's really a problem for me. Then you have we've talked about all of these psychological factors that can play a role all along here as well. And then finally, they put genes are in here. And this gets to what you're saying a little bit, Amy, in the sense we have some evolutionary, fundamental, functional things that play a role. So this basically, it's a nice, neat model, but you can see it's hugely complex. And it doesn't right away give you a clue exactly what you're supposed to do for an intervention, but it might get you started if you can break it down. So this is just a reminder of the informational factors and the biological factors we just went through. Now, to put this into a diagrammatic form, people have broken this down in a slightly different way. This is another kind of big integrated model. The center here, the green, is really all about the behavior change. And people need to be capable They need to feel like there are things happening that make it possible. That's the opportunity, social and physical. They're able to do it. The society is supporting it. And then they have to have motivation. And all of those things together, the ability, the opportunity, and the motivation, means that they're going to be ready to do it. And then, just as we talked about, there are all of these factors around here that are influencing all of these things. And they're very much similar to what we talked about in terms of the information factors and the preceding factors. So that's just a kind of another way to look at it. And so that what George and I have been doing is looking at these big models and concepts and figuring out a way to try to put them together and to simplify things enough that we can actually make a difference. And I think we've thought one way to do that is to focus very simply on barriers and facilitators. And there's a lot of literature in medicine where barriers and facilitators are the things that are measured and are manipulated in order to try to move somebody from one place to another. So it's a very typical way of thinking about things. It's pretty simple to put things into those categories. So you take your current behavior, you're going to deal with barriers and facilitators that are specific to the stage of change and get your desired behavior. You'll have interventions that reduce barriers and then interventions that enhance facilitators. And that would be how you would first start identify, well, what stage of change are people at that you want to reach? What are their barriers? What are their facilitators? How can we have an impact on them? And so this is not how we're going to present this, but this is just how we've been thinking about it. Just as an example, we took barriers to behavior change and some general ones that we sort of talked about. That habits are hard to change. That might be further developed into some other concept. Foregoing pleasure is difficult. Inconvenience that has more to do with logistics, taking more time. It's too expensive, and I may believing it's not important or it's not going to have any impact. So you kind of you can look at all the various behaviors and you can see which ones are most important potentially. So like the EV, it's the financial cost primarily potentially. And so we did that for all these behaviors. This is very rough, but just an idea of how conceptually we might be thinking about this. And then you have the facilitators. You have respected role models, just receiving general approval from other folks around you, saying, "Hey, it's good," cheering you on, or cheerleaders. Yeah, a good thing. And then something that's clearly been very important. I think if people have been remember Marianne Krasny and the work that she presented, very much social norm is really critical, and something called dynamic norm. If you tell people that an increasing number of your neighbors are eating tofu, that can have an impact, even if it's only 5 right now. It used to be 0, but it's up to 5. And of course, if the whole neighbor's eating tofu, the neighborhood's eating tofu, then you're really in good shape. And now that's all that's available in Stop and Shop anymore. You can't even buy hamburgers. And then clearly there's incentives that lead to financial savings or material benefits. So obviously rebates, tax credits, and all of that stuff can make a huge difference in certain cases. You don't have to get a rebate for buying tofu for the most part, but for your EV and for your heat pump, good thing. A health benefit could be a facilitator. They sort of say, yeah, that's a good thing. I'll do that. Obviously, effective advertising, making it easier to do the right thing, and having a strong belief. So clearly, if our audience is the converted like us, that we really believe we need to do this, it's important for you're in one place. But if the folks have a very weak sense of like, well, the climate change is down the road, I've got more important things to do, you have another challenge and have to think about it differently. So I think that's where we're going to. So here's where this is the final ultimate model that folks are looking at now in the healthcare field, where they put everything together here. These are all the interventions on the outside that have impacts on all of these other things that play a role in these more local factors that then have an impact on the behavior. Okay, so and then lastly, the interventions that we might consider incentives, penalties, the choice architecture that is, putting the tofu right next to the ground beef, so it's easy to pick it. Educational messaging and efforts. Obviously, that's a lot of what is done. That's what our is happening in Massachusetts in theory right now, that we feel like Melissa Hoffer has been telling us that we're having a big publicity campaign around climate change. Other kinds of motivational messaging, motivational programs like what George put together to got people together to try to get out of Bank of America, giving them some social support, and again, simple product placement or choice architecture. So that's sort of where we're at there. Now, George, you had another piece to add on to that, and this is where we're working on thinking about integration, but maybe we should stop here for a minute and see what people think. How is that clear? How useful is it? What could we do differently? What questions come up?
Ed?
You're on mute.
4 words come to mind: opportunity, accessibility, availability, and able to be implemented. And all those tie into a lot of the motivational communication factors. And as I think about this, maybe one way to present this is take an example of something and apply it, as opposed to starting with a theoretical model. And the model I'm thinking of, example I'm thinking of, my gas furnace is 21 years old and I need to replace it. So now the question is, you want us, we, who are driven by the noble goal to affect climate change and move off gas and reduce gas emissions, say, let's get them a heat pump system. Now the question is, the opportunity is driven by the age of the gas system that they have. The accessibility is a combination of who can do it, and then are there barriers on their local building that will prevent them from doing that, like they got a neighbor who doesn't want a noisy compressor outside? And then is it available to me? Well, yes, it is available. That's not a problem with that. But is it implementable? And that becomes an installation issue of finding the right contractor. So all of those elements present, and it's all driven by the opportunity of finding out who has the old piece of equipment. Unlike tofu, that's a totally different issue. The opportunity is we can change people's habits if we give them something that we know they'll like better because we like it better. But how do we convince them to like it better? So there are two different.
Yeah, I would agree.
That are goal motivated. So that's the issue, and to take two different models like that would be very instructive in terms of. And it doesn't have to be the models of tofu or gas furnace, but they're very pragmatic things. And you can, as you're doing this, I was sitting there watching all the elements in the charts and saying, well, this element is met by this, and this element is met by this. And the model worked in those circumstances, but it was a concrete experience that a lot of people are going to have.
Mm-hmm. So two things. So one, you suggest beginning really more with an example and then tell you how I got there, as opposed to saving the example for the end. So other people comment on that. And I do think everything that you said could be broken down into barriers and facilitators, but the different, the concept of the opportunity is a facilitator. It's a need. It's kind of if you have a need, that's going to motivate you to do it. So it facilitates making the change. So I think those categories still might work there, but we'd still use your terms. So you added some terms to the vocabulary. Arnie.
Yeah, so what I'm finding is each piece of the presentation so far is interesting in and of itself. But I'm having, I guess my short-term memory isn't as good as it used to be, but I commented earlier on in the presentation on the sort of 3 buckets that you had, and that seemed to be an interesting perspective. But then I sort of you know, as we got on in your last presentation, Roger, on the, you know, the behavior change in healthcare, you know, it got a little complicated for me. And then I was trying to relate it back to what George said and what you said earlier. And I was having a hard time putting the pieces together or remembering even what the pieces were. And I don't know if other people had that same reaction, but you know, it would, you know, if you could somehow, and I don't, you know, I know there are all these models and all these thoughts, and if there's some way that this could be to be put together in a, you know, more top level cohesive, you know, couple of, I don't know, it may not work that way.
Let me ask you this, Artie. I raced through that and didn't
Yeah.
really spend a lot of time. Is some of that the fact that if I'd taken that integrated model and really worked with that and stayed on that page, as opposed to just rushing through it? Or is there just too much even in that model to be grasped? And I could break that down into 3 separate slides and just start with the one piece and then say, well, then there are these other factors, but keep it off the slide and then put them all together on a last slide. Once you've kind of grasped all the different pieces, is walking through it more slowly, putting it together more slowly, or is the notion it's going to be too much no matter what we do?
I think walking through it more slowly, you know, one of the things that would be useful, because these health behavior models, you know, I'm presuming they all have presumably are aimed at having a near-term positive experience for an individual.
Right.
And that, you know, that's in most cases very different than the behavior changes that we're trying to drive to mitigate climate change. And you know, whether, you know, so making that distinction, I don't know if you agree with me about that, but I think Rashid said something like that. I mean, these are, you know, stopping smoking or changing your diet or exercising more. Those, you know, those are going to have presumably near-term positive impacts on your personal health.
Right.
Whereas, you know, all the other behavior changes, or most of the other behavior changes that we're talking about to mitigate climate change, have none of those near-term personal benefits.
Absolutely. So that, yeah, that is, I mean, I should make that point. It's clear that you're starting from a place where people think this is going to help me. Maybe not right away. Stopping smoking is going to prevent lung cancer 50 years from now. But it has to do with me personally and my health. And that's a big difference right there. And that's why, I mean, there's no way, I mean, nevertheless, I mean, that's the question. I think a lot of these concepts still work because we are talking about individual behavior. Building motivation requires a new motivation. It's not about personal health. It's because we believe it has to be done. So there's like, within the behavior change field, it's critical that we find a way, and some of it is like a lot of, maybe this is only going to work for the converted, who already, like me, you know, like I should be getting out of Bank of America, and I almost took the first step, but I'm not doing it. So there are a lot of things that all of us who are convinced and motivated that we're doing it for our grandchildren, we're doing it for, and it's almost like we're doing it for us. So it's almost like a health behavior. If we have enough belief already that it has to be done, we still are not doing it. And so that might be the main audience for this, potentially. I'll say, Betty.
So I had a few things to say. One is that I agree with Ed that an example ought to come first. I also agree with Arnie that layering of models, no matter how slowly they are explained, is not going to grab most people. It does not give you an emotional hook. It's not a reward exactly. I think you have to apply your criteria to your approach. Everybody doesn't love lots of models, and they are not the best way to reach people. So, and then, Yeah, so I think it needs to be, you know, if you want to do a model, pick one, and perhaps your integrated approach was the right way to go. But this is a case where less is more, you know, and
So-
I love the subject, but I'm just
Yeah.
phasing out. And I did have one, can I just say one or two more things? Just
Yeah.
want to put in there. So there is an example of an event of an effort to convey the importance of climate action that I just want to give you a link to. And oddly enough, it is the Massachusetts government. So if you go to, and I'll put it in the chat, mass.gov/topics/climate action, you will find something called Everyone Can Take Climate Change. Sorry, is that right? Yeah, everyone can take climate change, climate action.
Yeah.
And the reason why I think this is a good example is, first of all, it is positive. So, you know, you get out of the negativity, it gives you, oh, this is good, something positive. It uses illustrations and photos and things that are folksy and that appeal to values, like regular guys working on something, in this case, the heat, or your yard and how you can, you know, and they extrapolate a long way from your yard in the discussion. But the picture and the approach, it pings on these various rewards, like regular guys working is good. Your home and improving that or making that more climate friendly is good. It's your home. So they've all got these kinds of emotional reward hooks in them. So I would really suggest that you have a look at that, because I thought they did a really impressive job. And somewhere in there are people who actually understand this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They're behind that piece.
No, and this could be another theory that needs to be rolled in here. And just to respond to your first thing, Betty, I think George and I have talked about how the way this kind of stands now it's more of an expert series. People who are really interested in learning how to build better interventions and are involved in that. Those are the kind of folks who might appreciate this and have some discussion about it. What it would look like for a deep dialogue, it's an interesting question. I mean, who would even be interested in it if they're not interested, if they're not at a place where they, well, I guess if they want to change their own behavior, maybe we should go right to the reflective thing and really try to explore this with people and then build something out of it. Anyway, some thoughts on that. And then what you're talking about, a somewhat different model. We had talked about getting into at some point, maybe not part of the same presentation, talking about the theories of advertising, which is to some extent what you're saying as one, and that's a different, you know, it's typically advertising, if it's mass advertising, doesn't get a chance to pick its audience. It doesn't say pre-contemplative, it just throws something out at everybody. We're talking about maybe there's a time to think about your audience when you have a more specific intervention and other opportunities. But you're totally, I'll take a look at that, and that definitely could be thrown in there. Amy.
So I think what you're saying about, I mean, I think I could see this as both an expert series and a deep dialogue, but, you know, designed differently as you're talking about it. I was taking pictures of some of the models because I'm thinking about people that I know or other parts of my life where we're wanting to influence change. And it just is really helpful to look at these stages of change and think about what kind of intervention a person needs, depending on whether they even know the situation or how far along they've gone, what kind of support they need. But then it's also really useful looking at the barriers and the facilitators to see, because there's the individual variables about, you know, what's going to get in their way or enable them to make change. So I just found that really helpful. The place where I got bogged down was COM-B model behavioral wheel. Now, again, maybe if you went through that slowly, that could be useful, but for me, it was like an overwhelming amount of information.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think George recommended not putting that in. It would only be there if we flashed it up to say, this is how complicated it is. This is what people have put together. We're going to take it apart for you. We're not going to walk you through this. And maybe we don't even need to do that. But that was really the objective there. I totally agree with you. And it's partly because I'm sort of fascinated to see where the field has gone, and that this is this whole, that people that keep building and making more complex.
Trying to account for every variable you might.
I know. Well, people claim that they start with this and they think through their intervention and, you know, look at all the pieces of this and they have their theory. All right, George.
So Ed really struck a chord with me with the opportunity, accessibility, availability, and implementability. Because when he first said it, I'm gonna buy maybe a heat pump instead of my old furnace. To me, that is a decision. It's not a behavior. But I think the thing that makes it a behavior is he walked through what he did to get to that decision. And we haven't incorporated that sort of stuff into our thinking yet, I don't think, Roger. It may be something that is yet another tangent to look at, but to me, that fits very nicely with the concept of having a story. And so, you know, Ed Wall, a friend of ours, was doing this. He decided to do this. This is the process he took. You know, it got a little bogged down here, but then he found this and that. And then in the end, he's a really happy guy. And he's also, you know, doing the climate change thing. So to me, that might, if we do that kind of as maybe a first example, it kind of takes two birds with one stone in that it says making a decision that's appropriate for climate change is also backed up by a set of behaviors that are appropriate. And here's a good way to do it. So that's just what it struck me when he said it. It was like, oh, well, there's a behavior tucked in a decision, you know.
Well, decision is built into the model around the motivation, the center box where people are in the contemplation phase. They have to go from not having decided to having the intention, which is the decision piece. It's wrapped in there and kind of buried. But
okay,
you have to make that decision as you move through there for sure. Ed.
Yeah, I like the reference to the Mass website because it says City Hall is behind you. They want you to go there too. So you aren't fighting City Hall to get there. Although in our instance, George, we're still fighting City Hall to get the electrical power we need to do what we want to do. And we actually forced to put in a new gas boiler. So unfortunately. But the other factor is the audience. I wouldn't do it as expert series. I'd do it as the other series, because your audience is going to be people like me who want to go ahead and put in a heat pump to replace their aging boiler. And you're going to have people there who say, hey, I want to know how to go ahead and motivate my colleagues and my organization to put more effort into advancing the climate change. And your model fits both of those audiences. And those are the extremes of the audience. You got the people who have an immediate goal, like Amy, to make her heat pump work better. And then people who are from 350 or somewhere else who says, or Mothers Out Front who have this model of having induction stovetop demonstrations to stimulate people who want to motivate a whole bunch of people. And so it's a tool that you're conveying here and not necessarily an academic exercise or scholarly exercise of, you know, how do you, as a psychologist or a doctor, motivate people to change. And I appreciate the issue of stopping smoking and things like that, because our son, as a nurse practitioner, comes with these people all the time and says, you got to stop this. And they come back in and said, did you do it? I said, no, I didn't do that. I'm still smoking. So it's, and so you supplement that with pills or something else, but eventually the pills aren't going to work. And the pills are just a panacea for doing something that they ought to be doing. They just say, if I take Lipitor, I can eat more ice cream.
That's so true. Yeah, okay, just so I frame this, this is very, very helpful. So my sense is there is a way we could try to give people seem to like the stages of change maybe a little bit and some parts of that and maybe barriers and facilitators, but then go to showing, jump more into the what advertising techniques work around this, the positive message, the stuff that advertising people have figured out, and giving people a sense of, and well, and the other thing we didn't get was motivational interviewing, how to talk to people who aren't really there in a way that helps them build the internal intention as opposed to lecturing them. And it gets back to the moral kind of thing that and so maybe it's something more practical, a way to think about where people are at and things that might move them and what their barriers might be, but then some techniques and ways that people have gotten past this would be helpful, maybe. Betty.
Now, one interruption. Remember the Mass Save discussion we had. This is what we're dealing with trying to reform the Mass Save program. So that's a very interesting, occurred to me. So think about what we talked about there.
Okay.
Yeah. So thinking about examples, I have two sons. They both have 3 children. They both have gas stoves in their houses. And I have been at them, sending them things, etc., to try and get them to get rid of those gas stoves for their own sakes and for their children's. They don't do it. The reason they don't do it, they know it's a good thing. They know they should do it. But the financial impediments to it are significant. And so, finding a way around that is the thing that needs to be done. And I remember in the very first part, I think of some of what you said, Roger. You had a set of boxes. It was like a decision chain kind of thing with different elements to each step in the process.
Yeah.
That I think could be really useful in looking at a lot of these real life examples people are dealing with, because it becomes clear right off the bat as you go through each of those steps what the problem is, and then we can think about what to do about the problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
To me, that kind of thing is a really useful way, and that is very helpful.
So focus more on stuff that could be potentially useful to a general audience, not so much the theoretical basis and everything for it. Amy, you're on mute.
Building on what Betty just said, I can even imagine that being an exercise during a presentation of people, picking a situation like that and then thinking through either for themselves or someone they know, like where they get stuck and what would be use the model.
Okay. Now, George you have another small piece that you wrap. Do we have time for that? And do you want to do that?
Well, it's not, it really is just a way to frame conversation and things like that. But I think we've touched on a lot of that, given that it's already 2:40.
Okay.
People need to take off. But just to respond to to Amy, one of the things that we had thought about as the part of the second thing was actually to use Roger's motivational interviewing, pair up in rooms and do it. And I had built a tool that would help people think about what potential facilitators versus barriers they can adjust and see where that gets them. So I think what this means is we put our heads together and come back in another month with more stuff, right, Roger?
George put together this. I don't know how many people here have done En-ROADS, where you get move sliders and you can see how it changes. George's thing is like that around behavior change. It's very good. Okay, if we can remove this barrier, it just kind of gets you thinking about how you might manage this stuff. And he came up with that. How long did it take you to build that, George?
A couple hours or something.
2 hours. He built this thing. Anyway, we have this kind of talent in our group here. Okay, this is really good. I think we've got kind of marching orders in terms of how to kind of massage and deal with this stuff. Yeah, Ed.
Go ahead.
Oops.
In response to Betty, as you said, send them a check, find the stove, find the installer, and say it's a gift for my grandchildren. I mean, that covers a whole bunch of things. And it really is it's really the decision-making that an individual goes through. Those are the steps you go through in trying to do it, once you decide to do it.
It's not that simple. I would
I
have.
know.
What
We-
they don't have is the electric systems behind that need to be changed for the stove
Yeah.
and house features and things like that. That's the part that gets in the way.
Yeah.
Well, we did that for our son and daughter-in-law. We said, we'll buy the stove, you install it, we'll find the installer, and so that happened.
That's right.
But
Well, both
Yeah.
of the houses have impediments
Yeah.
to beyond
You-
that.
When they go on vacation, you have to go live in their house and take care of it. That's all they're there. That's the only solution.
You know, if I still sat on the board and had money coming in, that's great. but I don't.
There's already anyway. All right, guys.
All
so-
right, yeah, so next week is a chapter meeting. I don't know, George and Roger, you know, from all of the feedback you've gotten, you were, you know, I don't know if you feel you could come back 2 weeks from now and restructure the presentation a little bit to take into account what you've heard today.
I know. What do you think, George?
I think it's going to take a month, partly because I've got a few things between now and then.
Okay,
And since we're looking at it, maybe late September, October.
Yeah.
Give us a little more leeway.
Yeah, give us a little more time.
I'm going to be away for a while, and so that would be good for like first week in August. That could work.
all right.
Yeah.
But let's think about that, and then yeah, it's been endlessly fascinating topic.
No, this has been
It's just-
been great feedback. So
And
thank you.
Betty, I know you mentioned that book before. I'm gonna definitely take a look at that, and I think your thought about maybe asking the author if she would
Yeah.
do a presentation for us.
Yeah, that would be fun.
That
Yeah,
would
that'd
be
be
fun.
great.
Yeah, I can at least reach out.
So right now, I'd welcome ideas for, let's see, our next research team meeting would be on the 16th if we have it. But I don't have an agenda item or agenda for the 16th. So if over the next week or so, if someone can
Mhm.
come up with some thoughts about what our agenda might be for the 16th, I'd welcome that. And what I'm hearing from George and Roger is the 6th of August. Is that what that would be?
So is that
That's the, let's see, so it's not, so we have the 23rd, which would be 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th. We actually have 3 more Tuesdays in July.
it would be the 6th of August? Yeah.
Okay. Does that sound, George, does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds very
I'd like-
workable.
I just put that out tentatively. We're out of town the day before. I think I'll be back, but I
Oh.
need to check. Otherwise, it would have to be we got a couple things planned, but let's try to aim for that, and I'll see what I'll let you know if it's not going to work.
All right, sounds good. Well, great conversation. I mean, it's certainly a topic that keeps me up at night. Among other things, which we didn't get to. So any last thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up. I have been recording, so I'll send this out. I'll my usual thing, and George, I forgot to do what I remember you did at one point, is to convert it to a YouTube video, but then it doesn't have the sort of the AI companion that you had, if I remember right, in one of your recordings. That,
I have to
think
go,
this should-
folks,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
Yeah.
thank you. That was
You
I
did
think it
Thanks,
has it anyway.
You
Arnie. I think you can do it.
types
Okay.
work this out.
all right.
Great.
Okay,
Okay.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks
Bye,
for all
guys.
the information, George
Yeah.
and Roger. That was
Yeah.
fascinating.
Good.
Bye.